Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of TrekWars at OSU. That's Oregon State University. I'm Joseph Orosco. I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University, and I'm the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, projects, and initiatives that imagine a future free of domination, exploitation, war, and empire. One of our projects is TrekWars at OSU, in which we look at major sci-fi franchises like Star Wars and Star Trek to help us understand our social, political, and economic reality and to imagine transformations. The last year and a half has been really difficult and traumatic for humanity as a whole. Millions of people have died globally as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the United States, we have had over a year of civil unrest as a result of the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. We began this year, 2021, with news of a violent insurrection at the US Capitol building. And now we're entering a summer that threatens to bring devastating drought and fire danger to major sections of the country. The future, from our standpoint, doesn't always look so good. Today, we're going to talk about hope in our annual gathering of the TrekWars at OSU Collective. I'm joined today by Dr. Randall Milstein and Mohammed Shakibnia, both of whom have been involved in putting on our annual gathering of the TrekWars at OSU for about 4 years now. Dr. Randall Milstein is the senior instructor at Oregon State in physics and astronomy. He is the astronomer in residence for the OSU NASA Space Grant. Mohammed Shakibnia is now an OSU alum, double majoring in philosophy and political science. And he was selected as one of the outstanding seniors for the College of Liberal Arts in 2020. In our discussion today, we talk about how to distinguish hope from optimism and from faith, and how the Star Wars and Star Trek universes present us with stories that not only give us hopeful visions of a different world, but they help us to understand how to become hopeful in the face of despair, in a way that can strengthen our efforts to resist and overcome injustices. So let's turn now to the fourth annual TrekWars at OSU on the topic of hope. All right, so here we are with Dr. Milstein and Mohammed. Thank you both for being here. This is our Trek Wars collective, essentially. We've been doing this now, I think all of us got together to do this last, 2 years ago? And so, Mohammed, you were part of the presentation for that 2 years ago. And Randy, I was going to say congratulations. I think that we are now at 4 years of doing Trek Wars at OSU all together, both at Oregon State, and then all of us have presented, right, of course, at Rose City Comic-Con together as part of the Trek Collective. So we've come a long way. I think that what we should do is begin by sort of thinking about what the meaning of hope is and how we might think about the significance of hope in desperate and despairing times. And so I think that the way that we've decided to do this is to begin with Star Wars, right, which has hope broadcast in its big in some of the episode title names. So Randy, why don't you begin a discussion for us about the meaning of hope, and then hope in Star Wars and what all that means.
Well, I want to kind of give you a definition of hope, at least from where I'm coming from. And then we'll again talk about how hope shows up in Star Wars as a big theme. But we need a definition kind of hope first. And that hope is usually seen as an action that's based in uncertainty and fear of the unknown. And that it often describes being unsure about the circumstance that you find yourself in, and then wishing for some kind of an outcome that's conducive to whatever your desires are. And hope in that way offers possibilities to people. And we find that hope waits for those who can endure something, like Ray. Now, hope is really interesting because it's very different from faith. Faith tends to be an acceptance of what we imagine to be true, but cannot be proven, and it's based on our biases. Faith doesn't recognize uncertainty or coincidence, and faith tends to exist solely on blind resolution and complete trust in something. Now, one of the interesting things is that faith-based thinking tends to limit possibilities, because no matter how the facts might add up, the proper outcome, whether that's a negative outcome or a positive outcome, regardless of your individual choices, is assumed to always work out in a predetermined way. And that's oftentimes orchestrated by some kind of higher power. And we see this, of course, in the Sith, not so much in the Jedi. Interestingly enough, too, hope is logically based because it recognizes facts and simply desires that whatever the facts are you recognize add up to a positive outcome. And in that way, that makes hope fundamentally optimistic about something. Now, the optimism of hope allows people to have confidence that they need to take on risks, especially head first. And you can imagine them to have a positive outcome. And then feel you can emerge victorious or on top despite what's often seemingly insurmountable odds. Now, in Star Wars, a famous saga, of course, by George Lucas, this is all built around the idea of hope. Because without hope, Lucas felt that we have nothing. And that hope is actually the most powerful force in the universe. And that's why the very first Star Wars film, when it was reissued as Episode 4, is called A New Hope. I find it very interesting that if you have a new hope, that means sometime before that hope had previously been lost, or there had been a period of hopelessness. And of course, we're going to go through the original episodes 1, 2, 3. Then we realized that, there was a period when this hope was lost. Now, I think this is really important to understand that the Star Wars mythos that exists around this great story now, so embedded as a mind virus in our culture, suggests that we and all things in the universe live in an interconnected, interdependent existence with equal parts of good things and evil things, and that they're bound together by the Force. Now, we learn through the canon of Star Wars that the Force is not malevolent or benevolent, but it has simply two sides. And those two sides are manifest in how you choose to interact with them and use them. You have a light side and a dark side, a good side and an evil side. And everyone has the power to choose between those two things. And that choosing is really important. That's part of hope, is free choice. You're not predetermined. And we learned that the dark side involves fear and anger and hatred and a lust for power. And the light side usually involves love, compassion, fairness, and above all, hope. And this conflict between the light and the dark, the good and the evil, is continually fought, and it doesn't have a predictable outcome. And this is where I think hope comes into play in the Star Wars universe. In the Star Wars saga, hope exists in the exact same way that the Force does. And that is, it's this constant presence. It drives the universe forward. It's optimistic, going ahead. And it's dictated by individual choice. You may fear your hope is lost. You may think your hope is lost, but you can always choose a new hope, just like Episode 4's title. Also in Star Wars, I find that hope is about looking forward, not about looking back. The idea of hope, holding it close to yourself in your heart and mind, establishes an expectation for something that could happen. And if you keep that hope alive, as Ahsoka Tano tells us in the canon, you can make it through the night to the next day. And I think it's important that in Star Wars, one of the things that we learn if you follow the characters throughout the arc of their stories is that, number one, confronting fear is the life journey of all Jedi. And it's also the life journey of any other character in the Star Wars canon that's on a path of awakening to a new world. Maybe they're healing from something, a path of love or honesty, or finding a life with meaning. Luke Skywalker. And hope allows them to see challenges then as potential opportunities rather than giving up. All is lost, is predetermined. That's not the story that's being told there. I think this is one of the really important moments in Star Wars. It's when Princess Leia says, "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope." She records that message of hope, puts it in R2, puts him in the escape pod, blasts him off to Tatooine. She hopes that her message will find Obi-Wan Kenobi. And it does in the end. Now, I also think that if you follow the canon and all the characters in Star Wars, hope is often solace for those characters as well, especially if they're on the verge of losing almost everything. It could be their optimism is waning, or they fear their end is near. It's a hopeless situation. They remember what seems to be their only hope. I think of the one where they're on the planet Crate and they're trapped in this thing. Their only hope is lost. Everything is done. And yet Luke shows up. That only hope arrives to help them. And in that idea of having hope alone, they find that their options aren't limited. There is a future for them. And as Yoda says, because if one hope is lost, there is another. You can always have another hope on top of things. I think that's a really strong message. There's always another hope. Now, throughout everything, I think it comes down to this, that in Star Wars, hope can be found in this message. Anyone in the Star Wars saga that says, "May the Force be with you," those are words that request hope to someone else. And that's a very powerful message. And I think it rings through the complete saga. You're making that request for someone else, not for yourself. May the Force be with you.
Well, thanks, Randy. That's a really interesting point. I hadn't really thought about this, right? As the overarching message of Star Wars being one of having hope, of having to deal with despair, and giving us ways of thinking about how to imagine the challenges that we face in our lives as opportunities to develop a new hope. So fundamentally, right, the message that you're putting out is that this is really something that's meant to enliven us, to make us stronger in the face of adversity.
It's optimistic. And you see it, I think, in, The Last Jedi and The Force Awakens, that you see that Luke Skywalker's character has become hopeless. And it takes that renewed feeling in him that he can hope again for something that brings him out of his shell. And he shows up on Crate to help. But he had become a hopeless character. But I think he was hopeless at the start in the New Hope too. He's trapped on Tatooine, he's never going to go anywhere. And Leia's message is, Obi-Wan, you're my only hope. Ends up with Luke. Luke ends up giving it to Obi-Wan. So he hears that message. And I think you see a lot of talk about hope in the words of Rey, but I really think you see a lot of talk about hope in words spoken by Ahsoka Tano all the way throughout the canon. And I think that she is a very, very powerful character that should be given a lot more props.
Why do you think that she's the mouthpiece for hope? Why is she the strongest voice for hope in the saga?
She's been misportrayed. She was accused of things she did not do. She did not lose hope that there are still possibilities. I think she also understands that the universe around her is not black and white, good and evil, Sith versus Jedi, and they've assumed these roles. She understands that things are gray. I mean, she is the archetype for me of the gray Jedi. And I think that if I was Dave Filoni or somebody writing the new Star Wars stuff, I would like to see an encounter somewhere down the line between Rey and Ahsoka Tano, where Rey can learn from her and is not this pillar of, just the good, but learns the difference between the two, because she is a conflicted character still to this day, despite the way, the last film ended.
So Ahsoka Tano has an ability to sort of understand the nuances of the universe in a way that we haven't really seen portrayed with either the Sith or the Jedi, that you think provides a kind of a really helpful understanding of what it means to have real hope in the world.
Yeah, and how she talks to some of the young people she encounters in the Clone Wars.
Exactly.
The lessons that she issues to them are ones that are hopeful. And don't feel despair. Yes, things don't seem so good, but if you look for opportunities, there may be challenges now, but they can be opportunities, and things can move forward. I just think that's a very powerful character. I know that when she showed up in The Mandalorian, my heart lifted, as a real character. So.
Well, so Mohammed, I know that a lot of the work that you've done in analyzing Star Wars focuses on the universe as spelled out in things like Rebels and the Clone Wars. And so, for you, how does hope manifest itself in the Star Wars universe?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me here. I still remember the first TrekWars event on campus. I was sort of shuffling around in my Jedi robes trying to get there, being laughed at and snickered at. But I don't mind it, because we got to represent our geekdom and our fan base. But I really appreciate you having me, and it's always great to be a part of this. I wanted to touch on Dr. Milstein's point about Ahsoka too, and how Ahsoka represents this embodiment of hope. And I think that's very true because of what you said. Like in the Clone Wars, when she's expelled from the Jedi Order, she's in a total state of despair. She feels that people have betrayed her. Uh, she has nowhere to go. She feels lost. And then she finds Trace and Rafa Martez in the underworld on Coruscant, right? And she realizes that these two people, very poor, abandoned, uh, part of poor and abandoned communities in the underworld of Coruscant, have it much worse than her. She sees this sort of shared humanity in what the Jedi were supposed to represent, and how they sort of lost their way. And because she saw their stories and sort of heard where they were coming from, they had to work these odd jobs to make ends meet. They didn't have very many opportunities. They were stuck in this dead end, really, like many of the people in the galaxy, and particularly on Coruscant, where the Republic was supposed to take care of them. She realized that she has to fight for these people. She has to keep working towards a better future because of that shared humanity that exists. And I think that's a really important point, because the Jedi as an institution, they failed in that regard. And she, in my opinion, was the real embodiment of what they were supposed to represent. Um, and she went on to do that, as we see in The Mandalorian, and being a part of the Rebel Alliance after the fall of the Republic. But I think also, like in this broader message of hope, a lot of it after the fall of the Republic wasn't just about, fighting the empire and its fascism and its human supremacy. It was also predicated on trying to build something that's better for people. Generally, trying to imagine a future that's free of oppression, where people's needs are being met, where they're treated with dignity and they have self determination. It was about building something rather than just trying to destroy something. And I feel like that's what separated a lot of what the rebellion represented, in contrast to what the empire was, where the empire was just constantly trying to suppress communities, hold power for themselves. Whereas in the beginning of the rebels and the rebel alliance, we really saw a more humanistic approach in how they wanted to create a better society. And there's this quote that I wanted to share from rebels. So in the beginning of the rebellion, what's important to acknowledge is that there were different cells throughout the galaxy that were beginning to spark. And they saw basically a society and the conditions that they weren't willing to accept. And one of the sparks that began the rebellion was created by Ghost Squad, which we see through the show called Rebels after the fall of the Republic. And one of the characters in it, his name is Ezra. He's a young Jedi being trained by his master Kanan. He lives on Lothal, which is basically under military occupation from the Empire. So there is tons of poverty on the planet, very repressive conditions. And he joins the rebellion. He wants to sort of start a rebellion by broadcasting a message to the entire galaxy. So one of the first ways he sort of wants to start this revolution really is by reaching out to different people and trying to bring a sense of unity together. And so he takes over the Empire's communications and he sends this message to the rest of the galaxy. He says, "We have been called criminals, but we are not. We are rebels fighting for the people, fighting for you. I'm not that old, but I remember a time when things were better on Lothal. Maybe not great, but better than this. See what the Empire has done to your lives, your families, and your freedom. It's only going to get worse unless we stand up and fight back. It won't be easy, there will be loss and sacrifice, but we can't back down just because we're afraid. That's when we need to stand the tallest. That's what my parents taught me. That's what my new family helped me remember. Stand up together because that's when we're strongest, as one." So really this message starts to inspire marginalized groups throughout the galaxy that are under the Empire's military occupation to rise up and fight back. And the Ghost Squad, which Kanan is part of, has a lot of credibility because they had a lot of roots within communities in the galaxy, particularly on Lothal. They didn't just militarily want to fight back against the Empire through self-defense, but they also addressed the needs of people which resulted from poverty. They created mutual aid programs that provided food and resources to communities that needed them on Lothal. And they saw this more holistic picture of how we can actually address everyone's needs and try to really build relationships and trust in order to start our rebellion. And I feel like that really is emblematic of what we even saw last summer with the rise of the Black Lives Matter protests and how people were fighting against the racial injustices as a result of state oppression and systemic racism, but also in addressing many economic needs that people were facing disproportionately along racial lines as well, where Black communities were worse off in terms of healthcare, education, housing. People started thinking of how we can also address these issues through these mutual aid programs, about seeing our shared humanity in a really radical way, where people would contribute to these funds in order to alleviate a lot of the distressing conditions people were living in. And we even see that internationally against sort of state forms of oppression, whether through people's movements in India, people's movements in Palestine. All throughout the world, we've been seeing people rise up and fight back against really despairing conditions. You know, this isn't easy stuff to deal with. And while the chances, people aren't really thinking of the chances of success, they're thinking of how we can actually fight back because we have to. We have to create a better world. We have to envision something that's different than what currently exists, because we can't accept the current conditions that we are living in. And I think that's a really important point that Star Wars sheds light on, that hope is an essential component of any sort of resistance that people's movements want to create throughout the world. And we see that through the rebellion and also through many real world situations that we're facing with today.
something I always admire about your work, Mohammed, is that you spend a lot of time trying to sort of think about how the messages of Star Wars resonate in real life ways to sort of give kind of lessons about how to think about real life resistance, real life rebellion. So I always appreciate that about your pop culture analysis in kinds of ways. So I'm thinking about both of you have said here is that Star Wars is really an attempt to try to tell stories about hope as part of a broader kind of movement in the human condition, but also sort of, about political and social economic movements, right? So there's that kind of high philosophical question about like what does hope mean in human life in general when when things get you down, but there's also the question of like how do we deal with oppression. And so there's this overall sort of optimistic kind of message coming out of Star Wars is that hope is an important feature of human life, and there are ways about thinking about how to make hope real, and that hope is different than just simply wanting things to be different, but is a real belief that things can be different and that it changes us when we have hope.
I think, interestingly enough, too, that they will often tell you that Lucas was concerned when he was writing Star Wars that the Jedi are kind of like this cross between Christian warriors, the Middle Ages, and maybe Buddhist monks and things. And we have to remember that the society, and we talked about this 4 or 5 years ago when we did a Trek Wars, the society in the Star Wars universe still have slaves.
Mm.
It's very oppressive in that we look back in at least Western cultures that some of our greatest religious movements were people who were inspired and got hope from their belief systems under the oppression of slavery, whether it was Judeo, philosophy or early Christian philosophy, which is actually Judaic philosophy. But they were trying to find hope, and given, their teachers were giving them ways to cope and have hope under an oppressive regime. And we see that in Star Wars. These people have this hope for the rebellion or hope, of the philosophy of the Jedi that maybe their life can be better and not be slaves. And of course, Anakin gets literally taken away and given some kind of hope for a better life. His mother doesn't fare so well, but but yeah, this is a slave society, and I know that there are a lot of people who will tell you right now, despite the capitalist society we live in for economics in the United States, that it's pretty much a peasant economy.
Well, let me add to the discussion here then about as we do on Trek Wars, we try to sort of we've often talked about this as portraying a debate. It's not really a debate because I often find out that we're sort of talking about the same things in just in different universes. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how Star Trek talks about hope, which is, I think, in a slightly different way, but I think maybe gets us to similar places. So I wanted to talk about this kind of the radical hope of Star Trek in a way. And I'd like to begin with this quote by Michael Burnham from season 3 of Discovery, where she's trying to deal with the loss of the Federation in the 32nd century, right after this huge big time jump that's gone on in Discovery, and she sort of tries to boil down what she thinks the Federation is all about, and she says, the Federation isn't just about ships and warp drive; it's about a vision and all that believe in that vision. And there's this kind of joke that goes on throughout the season 3 about the true believers in the vision of Star Trek, and so there's kind of this nod that there's a core, kind of a DNA of hope in Star Trek. And so the question is, like, what exactly is that DNA? What's the radical hope that's part of Star Trek? Because Star Trek is sort of always known for portraying a kind of optimistic, hopeful vision of the future. And I think that this is captured in something that George Takei once said when he was reflecting back on Star Trek. He writes, there's this quote that he has that says, "At the core of Star Trek is Gene Roddenberry's vision of the future. so much of science fiction is about a dystopian society with human civilization having crumbled. He, that is Roddenberry, had an affirmative, shining, positive view of the future, close quote. Right. And so Takei is just sort of giving voice to what I think a lot of people think about Star Trek, which is that it is unique in a lot of ways in many different kind of sci-fi franchises for always holding on to this kind of vision that the future is going to be very different than what it is in the present and what it has been in the past. And we see in Star Trek First Contact, Jean-Luc Picard is talking to someone from the 21st century, late 21st century, and trying to describe what the world of the Federation is in the 23rd and 24th centuries. And he says something like this, right? The acquisition of wealth is no longer the driving force in our lives. We work to better ourselves and the rest of humanity. Right, which sounds great. Like, who doesn't want to, who wouldn't like to be out from underneath the grind of daily work and, living in a world where we no longer have to deal with the kind of racial, ethnic, economic oppression that you were talking about, Mohammed, right? The think about a future in which that kind of world no longer we have to deal with sounds wonderful. So if that's what Star Trek's about, that's a great vision. The question is, how do we get there, right? How exactly do we accomplish this kind of view? And Star Trek has not always been very good about giving us the kind of steps. It doesn't ever really give a blueprint of how to achieve the vision of the 23rd century, right? Where you have these fantastic, huge vessels exploring the galaxy with this enormous kind of power, unlimited energy provided by dilithium crystals, right? It's a world in which food can be. There's no longer food shortages, right? Hunger has been eliminated because we have these replicators that can give us whatever we want to eat, and we can go wherever we want, and unlimited energy. And so all this kind of worries that we have about loss of our economies and the loss of fossil fuels and all that kind of stuff, right? All these problems have been solved in a lot of ways through technology. So one thing is clear is that Star Trek sort of puts a lot of reliance on technology as sort of solving some really sticky kinds of problems in the world. And so I know that sometimes when people talk about hope in Star Trek, they say, oh well, yeah, you can have hope in that great vision that Picard was talking about because it's sort of you have this technology and science that solves all these problems. And I think that that's partly true. Star Trek is always focusing on science and sort of science gobbledygook stuff that's made up to solve really difficult kind of social and political problems. But I think that if you think about the universe, the Star Trek universe, and the way that we typically do here in Trek Wars, you see a different kind of story emerging that I think can sort of tell us a story about hope. And what I mean by that is that I love this kind of, there's a scene in Star Trek Deep Space Nine from the episode Past Tense, where Dr. Bashir and Cisco are transported to the 21st century San Francisco, and the city has been segregated into these what are called sanctuary zones, and it's just full of poor and houseless people, the sort of refuse of society. So while everyone is living these really elegant lives in the rest of San Francisco, thousands of people are living in these dirty hovels that are set apart from the rest of the city. And so this came out in 1993, 1994. And if you think about major cities in the world today, and especially in the United States, the problem of homelessness has become really one of our gripping problems, right? So it was very prescient in that kind of way. But there's this line that Dr. Bashir remarks when he's looking around and seeing all the suffering going on in the 21st century Earth, right? He says, 21st century history is not one of my strong points. It's too depressing. And I think that this is true about the sort of Star Trek universe. If you start to go back and start to realize that, the kind of vision that you see in Star Trek is one that's been accomplished. That is, that we've had to struggle and to fight to get to the world in which we have replicators and dilithium crystals, and wealth is no longer the driving force in our lives. There's been a humongous amount of struggle to get there. And I think that the ways in which we've struggled and the ways that Star Trek hints at that really tells us something about, I think, hope. So here I'm following a kind of an analysis of Star Trek that comes from political scientists in Miami or in Florida. His name is George Gonzalez, and he's written a lot about Star Trek and its vision of history. But what's interesting is that the stories in Star Trek sort of start to tell this kind of collective story of humanity struggling and overcoming obstacles. Right, Gonzalez talks about, right, if you start to look at some of, like, especially like Star Trek, the original series, there's these little glimmers of stories of how humanity has overcome really important kinds of social problems. Roddenberry, of course, was a real big fan of Abraham Lincoln. And so you find Abraham Lincoln showing up in Star Trek, the original series, in the episode The Savage Curtain as one of the heroes of James T. Kirk, right? And so there's this kind of image that the struggle of the Civil War, which for Roddenberry was a struggle against chattel slavery in the United States, was an important struggle, was an important moment in the history of humanity moving forward. Star Trek stories also, continually are telling us that one of the important things that we had to fight against was fascism, right? And so you have these stories in Star Trek. Nazis pop up in various ways, and sometimes very explicitly in Star Trek, as these forces that we had to overcome, destroy in order to move forward. So there's some real historical moments of struggle and obstacles to overcome evils of humanity that we have dealt with. And then Star Trek adds to that kind of continuity with fictional events. In Star Trek, the original series, we are told that humanity went through these really horrendous wars in the early 1990s called the Eugenics Wars, led by Khan Noonien Singh. Right, scientists went amok in the 70s and 80s and created these genetic supermen that decided to go and take over the world, and they eventually created all this tyranny in the early 1990s, and this just sort of upset a balance in the world that was very, very intense in the Star Trek universe. So from 1992, I think, to 1996, there's the Eugenics Wars, in which humanity is fighting against these genetic supermen. And we're able finally to defeat them and exile them into space. But the after effects of those conflicts set the stage for the next big conflict, which is World War III in the Star Trek universe. And World War III, the causes of this are a little bit murky in the universe, but it seems to be that there was this figure, Colonel Philip Green, who was a genetic supremacist, believed that it was important to get rid of inferior human beings. And he and a group of eco-terrorists start to do various kinds of bombings and campaigns of genocide that eventually leads to World War III. And this is, in the Star Trek universe, this seems to be a period somewhere in the 2030s, 2040s. So we only have a few more years before we have to start watching out about this. And we see, the World War III depicted in Star Trek: The Next Generation. In the first opening pilot encounter at Farpoint, we see a depiction of what one of these soldiers from the 21st century looks like, and very clearly there's this gadget that feeds them amphetamines to keep them going. So it's a rugged battle that turns into a nuclear holocaust, and there's a period then of what's called the post-nuclear horror, in which human beings are living in this kind of Mad Max state, and engaging in this kind of vigilante justice that you see also portrayed in Star Trek: The Next Generation. So starting in the 1990s, it's just a slow decline for humanity, according to the Star Trek universe, of all these periods of really awful things going on: wars, genocides, nuclear conflicts. And really a lot of this only starts to come out of this when we build a faster than light starship the Phoenix by the engineer Zefram Cochrane. This is portrayed in Star Trek: The First Contact, and this attracts the attention of the Vulcans. And so we have one of the big holidays for you guys all have May the 4th. For Star Trek, we have First Contact Day, which is the day that humanity had its first contact with another species in the galaxy, the Vulcans, and that sets off a huge other trajectory for human beings that allows them to develop into the origins of the Federation and what we see in Star Trek. But what I think that what Star Trek represents is this kind of idea that utopia develops out of a period of dystopia. And I think that you see this being told in the stories of us overcoming all these really awful moments. And I think that part of the reason that Roddenberry was telling the story like this, because he was one of this, the great generation, the good generation. I can't remember what those are. He wasn't a boomer, but he was part of the World War II generation. He saw humanity at a moment. He was in World War II. Gene Roddenberry was a pilot during the conflict, right? And at the end of World War II, which was this humongous devastation for the planet and for humanity, saw us coming out of that and working together to build something, that a body that at least could start to talk about building a new world with new institutions and new values, right? This is the United Nations in 1948. And I think it's significant that the flag of the United Federation of Planets, the unifying body for humanity, when we finally get all our matters in order, right? That's formed in 2161, right? The flag of the United Federation of Planets looks almost like it was copied right out of the United Nations coloring book. So the way that I like to think about Star Trek and hope is that there's a message coming out of Star Trek that I think resonates with one of my favorite philosophers, Cornel West. And Cornel West says that there's a distinction to be made between what he thinks of as optimism and what he thinks of as hope. And there's this quote from Cornel West where he says, "I cannot be an optimist, but I am a prisoner of hope." And what he means by that is optimism is this kind of blind or naive faith, maybe, in the way that you were talking about this before, Randy, a faith that things are just going to get better, that things always get better, that progress always happens, and that, in the future, things are just going to be different and better because that's just the way things work in the world. And Cornel West says that's simply not true, because if you look at the evidence, if you look at the facts about history, you see that sometimes there's progress, sometimes there's slides back, sometimes there's really awful things that happen. And the background story of Star Trek sort of agrees with this, is that in order to get to it's not a clear line from electing Joe Biden to the Federation, right? There's not a clear line of progress in that kind of way. There's a lot of bad things that happen. There's sliding back, there's destruction, there's death, there's disease, there's genocide. But the important thing is that the story, when we start to look at that, shows us that we have it within ourselves as human beings to come together, to pick up in the middle of all that destruction and change, and to live differently, and to envision different ways of living. And this is, I think, what Cornel West says is hope, is this idea that it's possible that the future can be different. Because if you look to see what we've done in the past, we have learned, we have changed, we've defeated some really awful things. It's not guaranteed that the future is going to be better, but it's possible if we can come together and bring the best of our game together, we can build a better future. So optimism says, oh, things will just simply be better. There's no evidence for that, West says. But we can hope that things will be better, given that we know that it's possible. We have it within ourselves as human beings to make a change. And so the story for me of Star Trek is that yeah, the universe in the 23rd, 24th way in the future, right? It looks a lot different than we are, and they have technology that's amazing and solved a lot of the problems that we have. But that's not really the answer. That's not really how we got there. How we got there is we learned from our mistakes, and we learned how to live better and to cooperate and to help one another out and to have compassion. And we fought against all the sort of bad tendencies of human beings to be destructive, to be hateful. And it's a struggle. So the past is written, but the future is left for us to write, as Jean-Luc Picard says in the latest Star Trek series, Picard. The future is something that we can move toward, and it can be brighter if we can learn how to bring together all the good things that we've done. It's not guaranteed that it's going to be a rosy sort of clear path from here to there, but it's possible that things will be a whole lot better if we bring out our best qualities to be with one another. Is that a different vision than Star Wars, you all? I said at the beginning of this, I think that sometimes we're talking about the same things, but do you think that Star Trek and Star Wars are talking about hope in different ways?
A little bit, but I think the message is also very similar. When you were talking about that at the end, Joseph, I was thinking about the final scene of the film The Last Jedi. Luke's dead, rebels get away, but it goes back to a small young boy who's a slave working in the stables, and was given a ring by Rose Tico. It was the rebel ring that can hide, and he has that hope in his hand now. And as he goes out to look at the sky, he simply reaches out his hand, and like using the Force, the broom comes into his hand. It's a very democratic vision of the Force too. That just like Rey, she didn't have a teacher. She wasn't anybody rich. She was on this poor planet. We find later on that her story curves a little bit, but this young slave can have that hope.
What I do think is important, I think there might be some connections between Star Trek and Star Wars, is Revenge of the Sith and the prequel trilogy. I think it does show how society, particularly in Star Wars during that time, because of endless war, because of sort of this authoritarianism that's starting to rise, or like this corporate control of the galaxy that is making people's lives miserable, it shows how sort of this republic, this neoliberal capitalist system begins to transition into really what becomes fascism and what allows the conditions for fascism to arise. And it provides lessons that maybe we should try to avoid that type of system, because it can go really wrong, and it does lead for that type of fascist order to come to be, like the empire, like the first order, etc. As like we see these situations repeat themselves in the Star Wars universe. And I think like with Star Trek too, it really does show some dystopic conditions. And like you said, Professor Orosco, we're living in those times right now. Just look at climate catastrophe, ecological catastrophe on the horizon. If there's any time that we need hope, it's right now, because we're seeing the hottest temperatures recorded in human history. We're seeing ocean levels rising, leading to more floods and natural disasters, leading to refugee crises, which are bound to happen. And right now we talk about like xenophobia and anti-immigrant rhetoric and policy. Just imagine what happens when these countries in the global south, particularly poorer countries, are affected by these catastrophes. When you have Kamala Harris saying don't come to immigrants in Latin America and Central America, right now, you imagine the type of conditions that might exist in the future, where there's going to be a lot of despair and needless suffering for people. And when we think about ecological catastrophe, you think about like 100 corporations are responsible for 70% of the global emissions that we currently face as a society, right? Fossil fuel companies are putting their short-term profits ahead of the long-term future of the world, or our families, entire systems that are living on the planet right now. So we really do show, like Picard indicated, you can't have money as the end all be all in terms of how you prioritize or structure your society. You need to have an understanding and a grasp of what human needs are and address those, not necessarily about creating capital and capital efficiency. That's maybe not the way we should structure or orient our society, because there are many dangerous repercussions that could come from that.
Well, I wanted to say one thing that you made me think about is that part of why I think that this discussion that we're having is so important about hope is that I think that what you both brought out and what I tried to bring out about Star Trek is that there are ways about thinking about hope and then thinking about how hope can motivate us to act and to treat one another, because when these issues that you're bringing up, Mohammed, when I talk with my students in classes and when I talk with people in activist circles, all of these things come out that you've been talking about: climate catastrophe, xenophobia, war, genocide, right? And sometimes when you bring this kind of stuff up, people's eyes just sort of glaze over because it's just so scary. It's just so intense. And for a lot of people, that I teach, the worry is that they become just sort of nihilistic about the presentation of this kind of stuff. It's just like, oh, geez, it's awful. And then there's nothing I can do about it. I'm helpless. It's just too big. I can't do anything about it. And I think what we've done in conversation today is to really talk about how hope is a way to combat not only despair, and sadness, but a kind of nihilism that says that nothing can change. I think that what we've shown is that these stories are really about trying to get us to think about the ways in which we can psychologically strengthen ourselves, morally strengthen ourselves to really make change happen. And I think that's a really powerful kind of message, because I think that when people study these issues, they just feel sometimes that they're just too ominous to be able to do anything about it. And I think Star Trek and Star Wars seem to be able to give us stories that might help us to overcome those kinds of barriers.
It's interesting, because this whole past year and a half with the coronavirus and COVID, and we talked about this being one of the reasons why we might want to talk about hope this year, that there was a lot of despair for people. And this thought of, life has changed. You have to adapt. And people refused to adapt. And I don't know whether that was they thought it would make them feel hopeless, but they just would not adapt. And your success is going to come with that adaptation, whether it's economic with a business or your personal life or whatever's going on. And then a refusal to accept the fact of this being bad. And then everybody keeps saying, well, I just want to go back to normal. Well, they think that normal was a previous status quo. Normal is what you're doing right now. So let's hope that this gets better, but that's going to require you to make a sacrifice. Adapt to the situation. Hope for the best. Let's hope to get that vaccine soon. We get the vaccine. We need 70%, hopefully, to be herd immunity. We're stuck at 45%. You've got this other 25% of the population that's just refusing to do what's necessary to give everyone hope to go back to being a positive and forward-moving culture. It's flabbergasting to me sometimes.
Well, what was interesting about what you said about hope, right, is that hope gives us a kind of forward-looking orientation about thinking about the future. And what I was saying about Star Trek, right, is that hope is about looking at the past and learning how we've done some really good things in the past to overcome obstacles, so that we can learn from the past in this kind of way, moving for the future. There's a way of thinking about the past that I think you just brought up, which is a sort of a nostalgia about how the way things were, and like, let's just go back there because that's the best kind of way things are. And I think that both of these franchises are telling us to think about hope as how we move ahead together, how we overcome problems, how we struggle together to build a better world ahead of us. And the worry is becoming trapped in the past.
Well, it's like I mentioned, that hope is based in choice, individual choice. You choose to be hopeful. It's not predetermined. And I hate to say that a lot of the culture lives in a world of predetermination based on the philosophies they choose to live with. And I'm not going to give names or anything, but I had an uncle who recently passed away from COVID because refused to be vaccinated because he felt his beliefs were probably stronger than any vaccine. And that's, different than being hopeful. It's predetermined. Well, too bad. Well, no, it isn't. You can make those choices. And it's the same thing with all of us during the COVID thing. We can make the proper choice. We can wear a mask. We can socially distance. We can take care of others in our community and make sure they're safe too and not be selfish. People, well, I don't want to wear a mask. It makes my face feel funny. That's an inconvenience, but being dead's an inconvenience too. And, if you're responsible for someone else being sick, that's a big responsibility. So let's be hopeful that our fellow citizens can do the correct thing and get through this so we can go back to university and be able to teach in front of our wonderful students like Mohammed, which we can't do right now. We're forced to do, 6 terms online. And we miss that. I'm hopeful that we can get to that in the very near future again and be able to share that energy and the positiveness of it.
So, final messages about hope, Mohammed?
Yeah, I think what both of you alluded to is when we think about our own society, we can't go back to normal because normal allowed for the conditions and the suffering that we are seeing today take place. Like,
Exactly.
just take what you all were saying with, the effects of coronavirus and how many workers felt so displaced and they didn't feel like they had meaning in the types of jobs that they were doing. We talked about essential workers being paid higher than what they're being paid now because they're on the front lines during dangerous crises that begin to arise. We've seen no indication that we're going to see a rise in wages. And we have to ask, who are we centering in society? Are we centering working people? Are we centering poor people, the most oppressed among us? Or are we centering the wealthy and the corporations that are dictating how policy is being carried out? And I think we really have to think about how we want to orient our society. We also talked about how because of the pandemic, we saw many people lose their jobs. They lost their health insurance because healthcare is tied to their employment. We have to think about how can we imagine a society where we don't see those types of fallouts occur, because COVID really did expose the weaknesses that we see. And one other indication that I thought was really important is how 4 million people quit their jobs because they didn't find meaning in what they were doing during coronavirus. They thought their jobs didn't give them any hope for a better future. They didn't see one where they found meaning or purpose in it. They felt like it was a dead end. And I think that sort of should make us reevaluate what we think about work in society. One of my favorite philosophers and sort of sociologist, David Graeber, talked about this, the meaning of work in society and how many people are working these gig jobs, these jobs that pay really poor wages. Half of workers in America make less than $30,000 a year. They're not in any unions where they have any sort of protection. And people spend their entire lives at work. And right now they don't see any sort of retirement on the future. So I think we really can't accept these current conditions that people are living in. And we have to have hope for a better future in order to create one that's more just and more equitable for society.
I know for me, over the last year, one of the things that struck me was this rise of a neo-fascism within American politics. And it seems that it's happening, it really started to rise to the front during the coronavirus. And I wonder at what level that there was hopelessness in those people's minds, that they couldn't affect any change, whether the change is correct or incorrect, for the rest of society. I don't want to judge on that, but just saying that they were attracted to that. Did that give them some thought of hope that they would have some kind of power, or that they could continue to live in this past image of what they thought was the right way that society should be? I don't know, but that had to be a reason that they made that choice and make that jump. And all I can think of is maybe they were hoping for something. I think it's a false hope, but coming from, more learned background, I think.
Yeah,
But
I mean, I think that that's what in one things that I really admire about the Star Wars universe, and credit to y'all, is the story of the rise of the First Order. I think is a really interesting kind of analogy to the rise of the alt-right and neo-Nazism in the United States at this time, right? This idea that, in the aftermath of all of this tremendous battle between the rebels and the empire and the crumbling of the empire, you would imagine that there would be this period of people feeling despair because their orientations are unclear. Like, is the Republic in charge? Is the Empire in charge? Who's in charge? No one's in charge. What's going to happen? Who am I? How do I fit in this? And that's scary. That's disorienting. And the rise of the First Order, I think, is interesting because this is a force that tries to look back in the past to bring some kind of sense of power and control to a situation that's pretty scary, right? That sort of power vacuum. And so Kylo Ren is looking for meaning in his life. And he attaches himself to this story of evil to give him that orientation. And I think that's maybe what you were talking about, Randy, is this kind of sense about that there's a lot of people, I think, in our world today, because of the conditions that you were talking about, Mohammed, economically, politically, a lot of people want stories of hope. And there's lots of them around. And there's some that aren't necessarily so good and not ones that are benevolent. And so while we've been talking about ways in which we think that these stories, these sagas tell us ways in which humanity can overcome the worst, there are sort of evil utopias out there. And that's something that we also have to contend with. And I think that Star Wars has always done a really good job of sort of portraying that kind of aspect about what human beings can sort of latch onto as well for meaning in their lives. Sometimes we latch on to things that are really destructive.
I remember during the previous administration, oftentimes seeing these mouthpieces for the administration at that time speaking and trying to think which one of them was Count Dooku. The man behind the curtain or the woman behind the curtain who is actually the big power player and had a really bizarre agenda. And actually, when you look at the Star Wars stories, and we talked about this a couple of years ago or last year, that someone like Dooku was the cause of all that. If you take that one person out of the mix, what happens? Who was control really but the people behind the curtain for the previous 4 years? And and then again, when people feel they don't have any hope that things can get better, whether it's what's happening today in the courts in Minnesota, what's going to be the outcome of Chauvin's trial. People want to see an outcome that gives them some sense of hope that things can get better, that we can change our policing, we can change people being summarily executed. We want to see that change. And I don't care how many people are talking about their hopes and prayers. That's just saying a bunch of words that you don't have to be responsible for. But hoping is a different thing altogether.
Well, that's a good note to end on, I think. I want to thank both of you, Randy, Mohammed, for a really great conversation. Another year of TrekWars at OSU, where we try to bring some of these stories to help us make sense of the world today. And I hope that the next time that we can do something like this, it will be in person with some other people in front of us and to have a really good conversation about this. I always enjoy my time with you. But thank you all for helping us to make sense of how we can have hope.
It's always great to be here, guys. It's so good to see your faces again.
Great to see you both, and thanks for having us.
And thank you all for listening in and sharing your time with us. If you have any questions or thoughts or comments about how the Star Trek, Star Wars sagas give us hope, go ahead and drop us a line at the Anarres Project on all the socials. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and also you can listen to our audio podcast on Spotify. So thanks you all once again, and till next time, live long and prosper, everyone.
May the
Stay
force
shiny.
be with you.
Yep, stay shiny. May the force be with you.